This is it. We have nothing left because of this. How could you let it get this bad?
I know, I'm sorry. I was trying to fix it, I really was.
This deal is invalid. We aren't paying you a single cent.
You signed the agreement. The debt is real, and it is due now.
Please, give us more time.
Part 1. The envelope hit the wooden table with a dull, heavy sound. No one moved. Jack stared at it, his brows tightening, his fingers slowly curling into a fist, as if his body already understood something his mind refused to accept. Across from him, the old man stood silently, his posture straight but weary, his hands no longer shaking, not because he wasn't nervous, but because he had already made his decision before stepping into this house. "I know this doesn't fix anything," the old man said, his voice low, steady, and filled with something far heavier than pride. "But it's a start." Tien froze. Her eyes locked onto the man standing in front of her, the man she had not seen in years, the man whose name alone used to tighten her chest, whose silence once felt louder than any insult. Her former father-in-law, the father of the man who had broken her, the man who had watched it happen, and said nothing. "Oh, why are you here?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the room. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly pushed the envelope closer toward Jack. "Because I should have come sooner." Just days earlier, everything had been falling apart. The small project by the pond, the one that was supposed to bring a sense of peace, of rebuilding, of something simple, had turned into something else entirely. Supplies had gone missing. The villagers who once welcomed them had grown distant. Rumors started quietly but spread fast, twisting truths into something darker. Jack noticed it first. He always did. "It's not random," he said one evening, standing near the unfinished structure, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the area like a man analyzing a system failure. "Someone is interfering." Tien didn't respond right away, because deep down, she already knew. Not who, but why. "Maybe we should just leave," she said quietly later that night, sitting by the window, her fingers tightly wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Jack turned to her. "Leave," he repeated, "after everything we've started here?" She didn't look at him. "I don't want you getting dragged into something that has nothing to do with you." Jack let out a breath. "It has everything to do with me," he said. "You're here." That answer should have comforted her. But it didn't, because this wasn't just about the present. It was about the past catching up again, and she had seen what that could do. The next morning, things escalated. The wooden beams they had secured the day before had been pulled loose overnight. The ropes were cut, not torn, not worn out, but cleanly sliced. Footprints circled the area, overlapping, intentional. This wasn't vandalism. This was a message. Jack crouched down, examining the rope carefully, his expression darkening. "Whoever did this wanted us to notice," he said. Tien stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself. "I think I know why." Jack looked up, and for the first time since all of this started, she told him. Not everything, not all the details, but enough about her past, about her ex-husband, about the family she left behind, and the silence that followed. Jack listened, without interrupting, without reacting. But when she finished, he stood up slowly. "And you didn't think I should know this earlier?" he asked. It wasn't anger, not fully, but it wasn't calm either. Tien swallowed. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Of what?" "That you'd look at me differently." Jack held her gaze. "I'm not looking at you differently," he said. A pause. "I'm looking at the situation differently." And that difference, it mattered. By afternoon, Word had spread that Jack's project was unstable, that investing time and effort into it was a waste. A few villagers stopped showing up. Others avoided eye contact. It was subtle, but effective. Jack saw the pattern, and it frustrated him, because this wasn't a technical problem he could solve with logic. This was people, emotion, history. That's when the old man appeared. He didn't arrive with noise, no announcement, no warning. Just a quiet figure walking down the dirt path toward them as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows behind him. Tien noticed him first. Her body went still. Her fingers tightened unconsciously, because even after all these years, she recognized that walk. Jack followed her gaze. "You know him?" he asked. She nodded slowly but didn't move, didn't speak, because she didn't know what to say. The old man stopped a few steps away, not too close, not too far, just enough to be seen, to be heard. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," he said. His eyes were on Tien, not Jack, not the surroundings, only her. "I don't," she replied immediately. The words were sharp, cold, honest. The old man nodded. "I understand." But he didn't leave. Jack stepped slightly forward, positioning himself, not aggressively but clearly, between them. "And you are?" he asked. The old man shifted his gaze. "Someone who should have spoken a long time ago." That answer didn't satisfy Jack, but before he could press further, the old man reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope. Back in the present, inside the small house, the envelope still sat on the table, untouched, heavy with meaning. Jack finally spoke. "What is this?" "Money," the old man replied simply. Jack's expression hardened. "We don't need charity." "It's not charity," the old man said calmly. "It's responsibility." Tien let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Responsibility?" she repeated. "You're talking about responsibility now?" The old man closed his eyes for a brief second, as if the word itself hurt. "I failed you," he said. The room went still again. Because those words, they didn't come easily, not from someone like him. "I knew what my son was doing," he continued slowly. "I knew how he treated you. And I chose silence." Tien's hands trembled. "You didn't just choose silence," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You chose him." "Yes," he answered. No denial, no excuse, just truth. And that made it worse. Jack watched both of them, carefully, analyzing, not just the words, but the weight behind them. "Why now?" Jack asked finally. The old man looked at him. "Because I see the same pattern happening again," he said. "And this time, I won't stand by." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The old man hesitated. Then, "My son hasn't let go," he said quietly. Tien's breath caught. "And he's not the only one who still believes you owe him something." The air shifted instantly. Tension, warning, something bigger than just a personal conflict. Jack stepped closer to the table. His gaze dropped to the envelope, then back to the old man. "And you think this," he gestured toward it, "is enough to fix that?" "No," the old man said, "but it's enough to start fighting it." Another silence. But this one felt different. Not empty, but building. Tien looked between them, her past and her present, standing in the same room, colliding. Jack reached out, not to take the envelope, but to press it back toward the old man. "We don't take money without knowing the full situation," he said. The old man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Good," he said, "because what I'm about to tell you." He paused, and for the first time, there was real concern in his eyes. Is going to change everything. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the palm leaves of the unfinished structure near the pond. The place that was supposed to represent something simple, something peaceful. But now, it was becoming something else, a turning point, a test, and none of them knew yet just how far this would go. The wind outside grew louder, brushing against the unfinished palm leaf hut by the pond as if something unseen was circling it, waiting. Inside the small house, no one spoke, not after those words. Is going to change everything. Jack didn't move immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the old man, measuring him, not just as a person, but as a variable, an unknown factor entering a system already on the edge of collapse. Then say it, Jack said finally, his voice steady but firm. No more half-truths. Tien stood still beside him, her fingers slightly curled, her breathing shallow. She didn't want to hear it, but she needed to. The old man nodded slowly. My son isn't acting alone. Silence, but heavier this time. Jack's gaze sharpened. Who else? The old man hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because of the weight of what he was about to reveal. People in this village, he said. A few of them owe him. Old debts, old favors. They don't care about right or wrong. They follow whoever holds power. Tien felt something sink inside her chest. That's why the materials disappeared, she whispered. And why the rumors spread so quickly, Jack added, his mind already connecting the pieces. The old man nodded. He's trying to isolate you, he said. Make it look like you don't belong here, that you're unstable, that anything you build will fail. Jack let out a quiet breath. That's not just harassment, he said. That's strategy. And suddenly, everything became clearer. He wants control, Jack continued, pacing slowly now, his engineer's mind shifting fully into analysis mode. Not just over her, but over this place. The old man looked at him with a hint of surprise. You understand faster than I expected. I don't need to understand him, Jack replied. I just need to understand the system he's using. Tien looked at Jack, and for the first time since this all started, she saw something different. Not just anger, not just confusion, but focus. What exactly does he want? Jack asked. The old man didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple. He believes, the old man said slowly, that everything tied to you still belongs to him. The words hit harder than expected. Tien's eyes lowered. That's not how it works, she said, her voice tight. No, the old man agreed, but that's how he thinks. Jack stopped pacing, turned. And you? He asked, looking directly at the old man. Why should I believe you're not part of this? A fair question, a necessary one. The old man didn't flinch. Because if I were, he said calmly, I wouldn't be standing here warning you. Jack held his gaze, long enough to test it. Then, he nodded once, not full trust, but enough. Tien finally stepped forward, her voice softer now. Why are you really here? The old man looked at her. Not as an opponent, not as someone from the past, but as someone he had wronged. For years, he said quietly, I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that family problems should stay within the family. He paused, and I was wrong. Her eyes trembled slightly. I watched you suffer, he continued, and I did nothing. That silence again. But this time, it wasn't anger. It was something closer to pain, shared. I can't change the past, he said, but I can stand with you now. Jack crossed his arms, And what does that mean exactly? The old man turned slightly, glancing toward the direction of the pond. Your project, he said. The hut. The work you're doing here. Jack frowned. What about it? He won't stop, the old man said. Not unless you make it impossible for him to interfere. Jack's expression shifted. Meaning you need support, the old man replied. Visible support. Strong enough that no one here dares to follow him again. Tien understood immediately. You want to speak to the villagers? The old man nodded. Yes. Jack considered it. Quickly, logically. If you're right, he said, then this isn't just about us anymore. It's about influence. And perception, the old man added. Jack exhaled slowly, because that, he understood. Fine, Jack said. We do it. Tien turned to him. Jack, but he shook his head slightly. No more running, he said. If we leave now, he wins. She looked at him, and something inside her steadied, because this time, he wasn't walking away. The next morning came earlier than expected. Word spread quickly. There would be a meeting, not official, not forced, but important. Villagers gathered slowly near the pond, curiosity pulling them in, whispers passing from one person to another. Jack stood beside the unfinished hut, arms relaxed but posture firm. Tien stood next to him, and the old man stepped forward. At first, no one spoke, because they recognized him, and that alone changed the atmosphere. I know many of you, the old man said, his voice carrying across the quiet crowd, and many of you know me. Murmurs, low, uneasy. I also know, he continued, that some of you have been asked to interfere with what's happening here. That got their attention. Eyes shifted. People glanced at each other. No one admitted anything, but the tension was clear. My son is involved, the old man said openly. That no one expected. Even Jack turned slightly, because this wasn't a subtle move. This was direct. And I am here to say this clearly, the old man continued, his voice firm now. Whatever he has told you, whatever he has asked you to do, he paused. Then, it ends now. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. One of the villagers finally spoke. Why should we listen to you? A fair question. The old man nodded. You don't have to, he said, but understand this. If you continue to support him, he looked around, at all of them. Oh, you're not just hurting her. His gaze shifted to Jack. You're going against someone who doesn't walk away. Jack didn't react outwardly, but the message landed, clear. Silence followed, longer this time, but different, because now there was doubt. Tien watched everything unfold, her past, her present, standing side by side, not fighting, but aligning. And that she never expected. Slowly, one by one, the villagers began to step back, not dramatically, not openly, but enough. Enough to break the pattern, enough to shift the balance. Jack let out a quiet breath, not relief, but acknowledgement. This was progress. As the crowd dispersed, Tien turned to the old man. Thank you, she said. The words felt strange, but real. The old man nodded slightly. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. Just a chance to do what's right. Jack stepped closer, still cautious, but no longer distant. This doesn't end here, he said. I know, the old man replied. And if your son shows up again, he will, the old man interrupted. A pause, then, this time I'll be ready. The wind moved again across the pond. The palm leaves of the unfinished hut rustled softly. But this time, it didn't sound fragile. Because now, They weren't standing alone anymore. But far beyond the edge of the village, a figure stood watching, still, silent, unmoved, because control isn't given up that easily, and the real confrontation had yet to begin.
Xin chào mọi người. Sau đây sẽ là câu chuyện kể về Tử Diễm, một người phụ nữ nông thôn cần cù, dành cả ngày để thu hoạch và bán quýt ở một khu chợ nhộn nhịp ở vùng quê. Mỗi quả quýt cô bán thì không chỉ mang giá trị vật chất mà còn tượng trưng cho hy vọng xây dựng lại cuộc sống với Toàn, một người đàn ông bị mất trí nhớ sau một tai nạn. Dù mệt mỏi, cô vẫn luôn vui vẻ, chu đáo, chọn những quả quýt ngon nhất để mang về cho nhà Toàn và bà cụ đã cứu mang anh. Lòng tốt của cô dần được làm mềm lòng của Toàn, và dù anh không thể nhớ về quá khứ, anh bắt đầu cảm thấy an toàn và được yêu thương khi ở bên cô. Qua những khoảnh khắc giản dị, cùng nhau làm việc, chia sẻ thức ăn và những tiếng cười thầm lặng, khoảng cách giữa họ dần phai nhạt. Ngôi nhà khiêm nhường tràn ngập nơi ấm và một niềm hy vọng dịu dàng lớn dần rằng tình yêu và sự kiên nhẫn cuối cùng sẽ giúp Toàn tìm lại chính mình.